According to the CIA World Factbook, there are 19 territories with a higher GDP PPP per capita than the US. Of these territories, 11 of them are generally considered to be tax havens.
Yes, and these tax havens have not only higher GDP, but also lower unemployment, and a higher average household income.
A tax haven is an entity that attracts foreign financial capital by offering very low tax rates.
You mean they're competing for your business by offering a lower price? Gee, it's almost as if these governments understand how business works.
Essentially, they've gotten rich off of foreign tax evasion.
So if you've been hurt and it hurts real bad, or if you have feelings that are making you sad, then it's okay to cry.
Oh, what's wrong there, PoliDice? Did reality and economics just wipe the floor with your precious social democracy?
Because of these countries' economic success, many people on the right often use them as an argument for cutting taxes in the US.
I mean, it's an established fact of economics that the economy typically does better when taxes are lower. I mean, it's not even economics, it's basic logic. Who's more likely to spend money efficiently? The people who have to earn their money, or the people who can just take other people's money?
When Ireland lowered its corporate tax rate from 40% to 12.5%, they basically tripled their GDP growth.
I mean, Ireland is nothing short of a libertarian success story. I mean, they spent most of their history without a government. Even today, the average Irishman pays some of the lowest taxes in the world. That means more whiskey and shepherd's pie for you.
Monaco. You can do this yourself. Look it up, guys. You don't need me to do this. The left does, because they're going to purposely choose not to do it. GDP per capita, $85,000. Really? Up to you guys. I mean, I don't know how the left has so lied to you.
I like how this guy's genuinely surprised about the left lying to push their own political agenda. You know what would really shock me? If a leftist came along and used honest data in their arguments. They used non-cherry-picked economic data that takes all factors into account, and they admit that the Scandinavian countries are actually more libertarian. Yeah, the left being truthful and honest in their arguments, that's the anomaly.
I mean, could you imagine if there was enough investment that we were all making about $90,000 a year?
Dude, you don't know the half of it. Between the taxes that are taken from us, the higher prices we pay for things due to regulations, not to mention inflation. I mean, the amount of wealth and prosperity the government just drains from us is staggering when you think about it.
But there's something pretty consistent about these tax havens. They're all very small.
What do you mean by small exactly? Because a country can be geographically small but still have a higher population and a stronger economy. For example, Japan has a way stronger economy than Russia, even though Russia dwarfs Japan in geographic size. Japan is smaller, yes, but they have a more industrialized economy, higher population, more contact with foreign investment. I mean, if you're going to use size as a relevant criteria, you have to be specific about what that criteria is and how it's relevant.
Now, if you'll remember from my social democracy video, I said that there were some cases where population does matter, and this is one of them. So what's the connection between Liechtenstein's tiny population and their tax haven success? Well, it should be obvious. The population is only 38,000 people. So if they can attract $5 billion in foreign investment, then per person, that's well over $100,000. So all we have to do is cut taxes, and then we'll double the size of our economy. No. 5 billion divided by 320 million is less than $16 per person.
So PoliDice doesn't seem to understand how foreign investment works. He seems to think that whenever money is invested into another country, that money is divvied up equally among all the citizens and distributed. What happens is that money is used as capital to create and expand businesses, which creates jobs and opportunities, which ultimately not only benefits the people of that country, but any country that does business with that country. Or to put it another way, the money being invested overseas in these countries isn't static. An investor could put, say, $5 million into a particular country, but because of the growth created by that investment, it ends up creating $6 million worth of wealth.
So, hopefully I explained that in a way that makes sense, but
yeah, not quite.
Many people will still point out that US companies are hoarding a few $1 trillion overseas.
And those people would be mistaken. Probably the biggest misconception about overseas investment is that that money just disappears. Like whenever a wealthy person puts money in a bank account in Switzerland or the Cayman Islands, they think that money just vanishes, never be seen again. Again, this is an investment. They're putting aside money to be spent at a later time, and the net result of this is positive on the economy. When these people put their money in an overseas bank account, these bank accounts pay back interest. And when you look at a lot of these so-called tax havens, you'll find that they actually have really high interest payback rates on savings accounts, especially Switzerland. So the net wealth that people are getting from these overseas investments, whether they be interest from bank accounts or stocks or loans or whatever the case may be, they're taking that money and they're coming back to America and spending it. So when this money is invested overseas, far from the common narrative that it vanishes, it creates a surplus of wealth, a good chunk of which comes right back to the States.
And they say the only way to bring that money back here is to cut taxes so much that we can uproot the tax havens and bring the money back here.
Well, yeah, that's kind of how the free market works. If it's cheaper to do business with your competitors, that's where they're going to go.
Let's be absurdly optimistic and assume that all $3 trillion will come back to the US. I'm not convinced that even $1 trillion or anything near that would come back, but let's just assume it.
Well, not all the money would have to come back in order for the benefits to kick in. Even if only a tiny fraction of that money ended up coming back as a result of this, that would still mean more jobs and more investment.
Now, that's not $3 trillion per year. That's $3 trillion total.
Right, but you're only looking at the money already invested overseas. In order to perform an accurate analysis, you need to also take into account the money now being retained in the United States that would otherwise have been invested overseas.
So let's look at this over a 10-year period. To oversimplify, if we multiply our annual GDP by 10, we get 194 trillion. And then even if we make the ridiculous assumption that all $3 trillion will come back, that takes us from 194 to $197 trillion, which is about a 1.5% increase in GDP, which is nothing to scoff at, but it's not financially sustainable.
The only reason it appears to be not financially stable is because you're only taking into account the money already invested. The potential future investments are where the long-term growth is going to come from.
Even if this worked, it would cost fortunes in revenue, which would either lead to a further burdened economy, maybe even another financial crisis, or at least very harsh spending cuts.
He refers to public sector spending cuts as if this is necessarily a bad thing. Is every government program really essential, though? I mean, even the most hardcore progressive will admit that there's at least a couple that we could probably do without. And even those government programs that are essential, who's to say that a decreased budget won't challenge the people in charge of that to find a more efficient way of doing it? This happens all the time in the private sector. Whenever there's a cut on the available resources, people have to find a more efficient way of doing things such that they can still operate with less resources. This is like the broken window fallacy, but in reverse. You know, with the broken window fallacy, you focus on the good things about an economic decision while ignoring the bad things, and in this case, with the cutting public spending, he's focusing on the bad things while ignoring the good things that could come from it.
That would, of course, hurt the poor and working class, leading to further inequality and further instability.
Well, in this case, the poor and working class would not only be paying less taxes, but have a greater pool of investment resources to draw from.
The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, is threatening the EU that unless they give in to her demands, she will turn Britain into a bargain basement tax haven.
What? You better give in to my demands or I'll let you keep your own money.
Off the coast of Europe. Well, Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House are very well aware of the consequences that would have. The damage it would do to jobs and living standards and our public services.
Well, apparently you're not so aware, because the average household income in these tax havens is higher than they are in most other places in the world. There's lower unemployment, higher literacy. I mean, the poor and middle class are pretty well off there.
It seems obvious to me this is not a viable option for a country with a population over 10 million.
Well, again, the money isn't strictly divided up equally to every citizen. It's put towards investments that eventually do benefit the citizenry as a whole. The primary factor in this case is how the money is invested. Population has little, if anything, to do with it. In fact, if anything, a higher population would increase the number of people able to take advantage of these investments.
Which is why, again, every tax haven success story is a very tiny country.
So India is one of the most heavily populated countries on the planet, and yet they experienced economic growth when they cut their corporate taxes.
But I want to highlight how backwards this discussion is. If you or I ever said, hey, instead of paying my taxes this year, I'm just going to stash my income overseas for a fraction of the rate. If you wanted me to pay taxes, then just cut the rate and maybe I'll consider paying it.
Wouldn't that be better, though, if you could do that? I mean, in the private sector, if a company's prices are too high, I can say, yeah, I'm going to do business with somebody else until you lower your prices. If I can do this with the private sector, I should be able to do it with government, too.
You'd be in prison.
Well, this is argumentum ad baculum. Oh, you'd go to prison if you don't pay your taxes, so obviously paying taxes is a good thing, right?
The EU is taking sensible steps in proposing sanctions on these countries that engage in these activities, while we on the other hand are cutting rates to appease.
Well, who would you rather do business with? Someone who was threatening you with punishment, or someone who was willing to cooperate and negotiate with you? If anything, this just proves how much more business savvy Americans are than Europeans.
The idea that we need to negotiate tax rates is absurd.
Well, literally every other business in the economy has to negotiate its prices to make its customers willing to pay, so I don't see why government should get a free pass on this.
Amazon made $5.6 billion in profits last year and paid zero in federal taxes.
Why should taxes be based on how much you earn? I always thought that was kind of stupid. I think it should be based on how much government services you use. Could you imagine if your electric company or water company charged you based on your income instead of how much electricity or water you used?
We don't need to ask Amazon to please pay their taxes.
Well, we don't need to, but I have a feeling they'd be more willing to if we did.
We need to say that if Amazon does not pay their taxes, then they cannot operate in the US.
Well, just because Amazon's not paying the income tax doesn't mean they're not paying any taxes. Anytime you buy something from Amazon, they add on a sales tax. Also, the vehicles that Amazon uses for shipments, every time they refuel those vehicles, they're paying a gas tax. And a lot of the routes they use for their shipments probably do involve a toll. And that's not to mention all the other little shit like the licensing and permit fees. So the idea that the government's not getting anything out of Amazon for doing business in this country is flat out false. Also, interesting how one-sided PoliDice's criticism is. He seems to focus on Amazon not paying the government, and ignores all the examples of the government giving special freebies to Amazon, like grants, subsidies, exemptions from local zoning laws, a lot of which actually hurt other local businesses that compete with Amazon. People like PoliDice bitch about corporate greed and praise government, but turn a blind eye to all the ways the government enables corporate greed.
And we will issue a warrant for the arrest of Jeff Bezos and anyone else involved in their tax evasion.
Well, why? What would that accomplish? Wouldn't it suffice just to say that they can't use any more government services until they start paying again? I mean, that would seem like a much more effective way of dealing with the issue to me. Do you support debtors' prisons, PoliDice? Should Visa or Chase be able to lock people up if they don't pay? I have a feeling you'll turn your nose up at that because you believe, like many other people, that government should be held to a separate moral standard.
You might not like the sound of that, but tax evasion is a crime.
Well, so is smoking weed and drinking under 21. Something being considered a crime, at least the way you're using the word, just simply means a politician doesn't like it. It was a crime to be Jewish in Germany during the 1940s, but that doesn't mean it was wrong to be Jewish in Germany during the 1940s. It's not enough simply to say that government disapproves of it. You have to actually explain why it is inherently immoral to not pay taxes.
Or at least is when you do it. If we make corporations pay their taxes, then they'll pay their taxes. They only get away with this because we let them.
Do you think part of the reason it's so easy to get away with tax evasion is because the government has a really stupid way of doing business? The government just kind of hands out its services and expects you to pay. If any private sector entity operated like that, people would see how stupid it is. This is why I think it would be ideal to have a system where you pay based on what you use versus what you earn. Imagine telling the electricity company that all your income is hidden in Ireland or the Cayman Islands. They'd be like, well, that's fantastic, but until we get that money, you better get used to candles.
Some people argue that, if we make corporations pay these taxes, then they'll stop doing business in the US. One, what you're describing is a hostage crisis. Two, yeah, right. To avoid paying a chunk of their US profits, they'll throw away all of their US profits. And three, even if they somehow did, they'll quickly be replaced by other small businesses because the demand for their products will still exist.
You do realize that very logic you put forth pretty much defeats any sort of justification for taxation, because if we get rid of the government providing these services, while the demand for those services is still there, another entity can come along and provide them. Congratulations, in one sentence you've literally defeated every other argument you've made in this video.
The problem with tax evasion is not a difficult one to solve. The only reason we let corporations play this game is because they effectively own our government.
Well, first of all, tax evasion isn't as big of a problem as PoliDice makes it out to be. Even if you dodge the federal income tax 100%, there's like 11 other taxes or ways the government gets money off of you. Also, the government's stupid way of doing business is also to a large extent to blame for how easy it is to get away with tax evasion. The solution to this problem isn't a socialist one, but a capitalist one. In order to address this issue, the government needs to, first, lower its prices so it can compete with these tax havens, and second, verify that people are paying before providing the service. Don't just hand it out. Make sure you're gatekeeping from people who don't pay. This may not guarantee that companies will invest their money here instead of in a Swiss bank account, but it'll definitely help. I also can't guarantee that you'll put your money in my Patreon instead of a Swiss bank account, but if I ask super nicely, I'm sure you will. This has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.